Well, good morning. It's Tuesday. It's good to be with you again. I want to start with a question for us this morning to consider. Do you ever have those things in your life that you never really give much thought to, why they are the way they are? They just are. They always have been. Like Eric's mustache. Actually, that's not always been that way. This year is really the first time he's ever been able to grow a mustache. So we're all really thrilled by that for him. But things like this is something I've never really given much thought to, but it is just the way it is. It always has been. Hot coffee, right? It is that way. I don't know why it is. It is that way. It should be, right? Iced coffee, who would do that, right? It's like cooked carrots. You shouldn't do that, right? It's just one of those things that in life that is the way it is. You don't give it a whole lot of thought. It just is that way. I think the catechism questions that we had yesterday and even today are kind of like that. Just things that you don't really consider. They just are the way they are and you move on. So the question that we're considering today, question 23, is this: why must the Redeemer be truly God? And maybe now that we hear the question, we would consider it and think about that deeply. But I think it's a question, unless we think about it deeply, it just kind of goes in and out. Yep, the Redeemer, our Redeemer, is truly God. Yesterday the question was, why must the Redeemer be truly human? Maybe that's one of those questions too, like, it just is the way it is. But let's think about it. Here's the answer from the Catechism. The answer is, why must the Redeemer be truly God? The answer is that because of his divine nature, his obedience and suffering would be perfect and effective, and also that he would be able to bear the righteous anger of God against sin and yet overcome death. Again, maybe not something we've thought about a whole lot. So let's do that. Let's think about it some. For Jesus to be our perfect Redeemer, his obedience and suffering had to be perfect and effective. Everything about him had to be perfect. Right? Even his obedience to the point of death, through suffering to the point of death in that, had to be perfect. Right? Allow that to sink into your sleepy brain this morning. That Jesus was perfect in every way, even in his suffering, even in his obedience to the point of death. That Jesus was perfect, and his obedience and suffering could only be perfect if he was perfect, and he could only be perfect if he was perfectly, fully God. In addition to that, the answer keeps going. He would only be able to bear the righteous anger of God if he was truly God. He wouldn't have been able to take on God's righteous anger perfectly in death and still overcome death in the resurrection if he wasn't fully and perfectly God. Only one who is truly God is able to do that. We looked at these verses on Sunday, but Acts 2:24, Peter in his sermon says that God raised Jesus up from the dead, loosing the pangs of death, and it wasn't possible for him. It wasn't possible for Jesus to be held by it. It wasn't possible, right? To be our perfect Redeemer in every way. That perfect Redeemer, he had to perfectly obey through the suffering of death and perfectly take on our sin and perfectly defeat death. And only a perfect God can do that. Allow that to sink in this morning, that we have a God, a Redeemer, who's perfect in every way, truly God. So here's the question again and the answer to end our time. Question 23, why must the Redeemer be truly God? That because of his divine nature, his obedience and suffering would be perfect and effective, and also that he would be able to bear the righteous anger of God against sin and yet overcome death. Praise God.